February 13th, 1945, 10:03 p.m. The air raid sirens begin wailing across Dresden, Germany. For most of the war, this city has been spared. While Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne have been reduced to rubble, Dresden, the Florence of the Elbe, has remained largely untouched. Beautiful, Baroque, a city of art and culture. Tonight, that changes forever. At 10:14 p.m., the first wave arrives. 244 Lancaster bombers of the RAF appear in the night sky. Within minutes, they drop nearly 900 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on the city center. The second wave comes 3 hours later. 529 more bombers. Another 1,500 tons of bombs. By morning, over 3,500 tons of explosives have been dropped on a single city in less than 14 hours. The firestorm that follows reaches temperatures of 1,500 degrees Celsius. Winds generated by the heat reach hurricane force, sucking oxygen from underground shelters and pulling people into the flames. The fire is visible from 200 miles away. When it's over, the historic center of Dresden no longer exists. 15 square miles of the city have been incinerated. The death toll? 25,000 confirmed. Possibly more. Some estimates ran as high as 100,000, though modern research suggests the true number was lower but still catastrophic. It was one of the most controversial military actions of World War II, and 80 years later, we're still asking the same question. Was Dresden a legitimate military target? Or was it a war crime disguised as strategy? This is not a simple story. There are no easy answers, but it's a story that must be told because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In total war, the line between military necessity and moral catastrophe becomes dangerously blurred. This is the story of Dresden. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what Dresden was. For centuries, Dresden was known as one of Europe's most beautiful cities. The Baroque architecture, the Frauenkirche Cathedral with its distinctive dome, the Zwinger Palace, the Semper Opera House, the Elbe River winding through the city center, lined with elegant buildings that seemed to belong in a painting. This wasn't just German propaganda. This was recognized internationally. Dresden was called the Florence of the Elbe, the Jewel Box, a city that represented the height of European culture and art. The Old Masters Picture Gallery housed works by Raphael, Rembrandt, and Vermeer. The city's porcelain was world-renowned. But Dresden was also a real city with real people. 630,000 residents in 1939. Families, workers, students, children. They lived in those beautiful buildings, walked those historic streets, went to work, fell in love, raised children. When the war began in September 1939, Dresden seemed far from the conflict. It wasn't a major industrial center like the Ruhr Valley. It wasn't a military headquarters like Berlin. It was relatively safe, or so people thought. As the war progressed and Allied bombing campaigns intensified across Germany, Dresden remained mostly untouched. There had been a few minor raids, small attacks on industrial facilities on the outskirts. But the historic center, untouched. People began to believe Dresden had an unspoken protected status, a city too beautiful to destroy. They were wrong. By February 1945, the war in Europe is entering its final phase. But it's not over yet. And from the Allied perspective, every day the war continues means more Allied soldiers dying, more concentration camps operating, more suffering. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army is advancing rapidly through Poland and Eastern Germany. They're less than 100 miles from Dresden. The Wehrmacht is retreating, but they're not collapsing. They're fighting for every mile of German soil. On the Western Front, the Allies have crossed the Rhine but face stiff resistance. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive, only ended a month ago. German forces are still capable of organized resistance. The strategic question facing Allied commanders is simple. How do we end this war as quickly as possible? This is where Dresden enters the picture. Dresden sits at a crucial intersection of rail lines connecting the eastern and western fronts. Troops, supplies, and equipment pass through Dresden heading east to fight the Soviets. The city has railway yards, communication centers, and some industrial facilities producing war materials. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin requests that the Western Allies conduct bombing operations in eastern Germany to disrupt German reinforcements heading toward the Eastern Front. The Soviets are advancing rapidly and want to maintain momentum. Any German forces tied up in the West or disrupted during transit helps the Soviet offensive. The British and Americans agree a list of targets in eastern Germany is prepared. Dresden is on that list. But here's where it gets complicated. Dresden's value as a strategic target is debatable. Yes, it has rail yards. Yes, troops pass through. But is it crucial? Is it worth what's about to happen? Some historians argue Dresden was a legitimate military target. Others argue it was barely justified. The debate continues today. The decision to bomb Dresden is made at the highest levels. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command, is a strong advocate. Harris believes in area bombing, destroying entire cities to break German morale and industrial capacity. He's been conducting these raids for years. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen. Dresden is next on the list. The Americans participate too. The United States Army Air Forces will conduct daylight raids following the RAF night attacks. General Carl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, approves American participation. But some commanders have doubts. Air Marshal Robert Saundby, Harris's deputy, will later write that he questions whether the attack is necessary at this stage of the war. But the orders come down. The mission is authorized. The plan is brutal in its efficiency. It's called a double-tap raid. The RAF will hit Dresden at night with 2 waves separated by 3 hours. The first wave drops high explosives to blow apart buildings and expose flammable materials. The second wave drops incendiaries to start fires. Then, the next morning, American bombers will hit the city in daylight to target anything still standing and catch rescue workers in the open. The timing of the second wave is particularly controversial. 3 hours gives time for rescue workers, firefighters, and civilians to emerge from shelters and begin rescue operations. Then the second wave hits them. This isn't accidental. This is deliberate tactical planning. The target area is marked as the city center, the historic district, not the rail yards on the outskirts, not specific industrial facilities, the center of the city where people live. On February 13, 1945, the bombers take off from England. The crews are told Dresden is a major industrial and communications center supporting the Eastern Front. They're told the city is an important military target. They're told this will help end the war. Some of that is true, some of it isn't. And the crews are about to participate in one of the most destructive raids of the war. February 13th, 10:03 p.m., the air raid sirens sound across Dresden. But many residents don't take them seriously. Dresden has had false alarms before. The city seems safe. Some people don't even bother going to shelters. This is a fatal mistake. At 10:14 p.m., the first markers go down. Pathfinder aircraft drop flares and incendiaries to mark the target area for the following bombers. The historic center of Dresden lights up like a Christmas tree. Then the main force arrives. 244 Lancaster bombers. Each carries approximately 4 tons of bombs, a mix of high explosives and incendiaries. The high explosives hit first, massive blast bombs weighing up to 4,000 pounds. They're designed to blow apart buildings, expose timbers and furnishings, create kindling for what comes next. Then the incendiaries, thousands upon thousands of small firebombs. They contain thermite, magnesium, phosphorus, materials that burn intensely and are almost impossible to extinguish. They land on the exposed timber and cloth and paper left by the high explosive bombs, and the fires begin. Within minutes, hundreds of fires are burning across the city center. The Frauenkirche, the Royal Palace, the Zwinger, the Opera House, apartment buildings, schools, hospitals. Everything is burning. People who ignored the sirens are now trapped. The shelters are filling up, but many are caught in the open. The bombs are still falling. Buildings are collapsing. The heat is becoming intense. 25 minutes. That's how long the first wave lasts. In 25 minutes, the attackers drop nearly 900 tons of bombs on the city center. Then they leave. The crews turn west, heading back to England. Behind them, Dresden is burning. But the attack isn't over. Chapter 5. The 3-hour gap, 24 to 28. The 3 hours between the first and second waves is when the true horror of the double-tap strategy becomes apparent. The fires from the first wave are spreading. People emerge from shelters to find their city ablaze. Rescue workers rush to the scene. Firefighters attempt to control the blazes. Medical personnel set up aid stations. Police try to organize evacuations. Thousands of people are in the streets, some searching for family members, some trying to escape the burning center, some trying to help. The refugee situation makes everything worse. In February 1945, Dresden is swollen with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. Estimates suggest an additional 200,000 to 300,000 refugees have crowded into the city. They're sleeping in parks, in train stations, in any available space. Many are in the city center when the bombs fall. During these 3 hours, people believe the raid is over. They don't know about the second wave. They don't know that 600 miles away, over 500 more bombers are already en route. People make decisions during these 3 hours that will determine whether they live or die. Do you stay in the shelter? Do you try to evacuate? Do you search for loved ones? Do you try to fight the fires? There's no right answer, but in 3 hours, the second wave will arrive, and whatever choice you made will determine your fate. 1:30 a.m. The sirens sound again, but this time many people can't hear them over the roar of fires and collapsing buildings, and those who do hear them have nowhere to go. The shelters are full. The streets are burning. The fires are everywhere. 529 Lancaster bombers appear overhead. More markers go down, more bombs fall. Another 1,500 tons of high explosives and incendiaries cascade onto an already burning city. This is when the firestorm begins. A firestorm is a specific meteorological phenomenon that occurs when a fire becomes so large and hot that it creates its own weather system. The intense heat causes air to rise rapidly, creating a vacuum at ground level. Cold air rushes in from the edges to fill that vacuum, creating winds that can reach hurricane force. These winds feed oxygen to the fire, making it burn hotter. The hotter it burns, the stronger the winds become. It's a self-sustaining cycle of destruction. In Dresden, the firestorm reaches full intensity around 2 a.m. Temperatures in the center reach 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass, hot enough to turn asphalt into liquid, hot enough to incinerate human bodies completely. The winds reach speeds of over 100 miles per hour. People trying to flee are literally pulled back into the fire. Shelters that seemed safe become ovens as the oxygen is sucked out. People suffocate without ever seeing flames. Trees are uprooted. Vehicles are thrown through the air. The noise is described by survivors as louder than the bombs, a constant, deafening roar of wind and fire. The firestorm is visible from over 200 miles away. Allied pilots can see the glow on the horizon as they return to England. Soviet troops to the east report seeing the sky light up. This continues for hours. The second wave ends, but the fire keeps burning. It will burn through the night, through the next day, and into the following night. Some fires will burn for days, and in the morning the Americans arrive for the third wave, February 14th, 1945. Dawn breaks over Dresden, or what's left of it. The historic center of the city has ceased to exist. Where Baroque buildings once stood, there are only ruins. The Frauenkirche has collapsed. The royal palace is gone. The opera house is a shell. 15 square miles of the city have been destroyed. The streets are choked with rubble and bodies. So many bodies that counting them becomes impossible. Many victims have been completely incinerated, leaving no remains to count. Others are buried under collapsed buildings. Some died from the heat, some from smoke inhalation. Some from carbon monoxide poisoning in sealed shelters. Some were crushed. Some burned alive. The survivors wander through the ruins in shock. Many are injured. Most have lost everything: homes, possessions, family members. The city's infrastructure has collapsed. No water, no electricity, no functioning hospitals, no organized rescue effort. And then, at noon, the Americans arrive. Over 300 B-17 bombers appear in the clear daylight sky. Their target is supposed to be the rail yards and remaining industrial facilities. But with the city shrouded in smoke, visibility is poor. Bombs fall on areas already destroyed. They fall on rescue workers. They fall on survivors trying to escape. This daylight raid kills hundreds more and completely destroys any remaining infrastructure. The marshalling yards are hit. The waterworks are destroyed. Any chance of fighting the remaining fires is eliminated. By the evening of February 14th, Dresden's destruction is complete. The death toll is staggering, though the exact number will be debated for decades. How many people died in Dresden? This seemingly simple question has been the subject of intense debate and political manipulation for 80 years. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels immediately seizes on Dresden for propaganda purposes. He inflates the death toll enormously, claiming 200,000 dead, even suggesting numbers as high as 500,000. This serves Nazi propaganda by portraying the Allies as barbaric terror bombers attacking a defenseless cultural city. After the war, these inflated numbers persist. During the Cold War, East Germany, under Soviet control, continues to claim massive death tolls to portray Western powers as war criminals. Dresden becomes a propaganda tool. In the West, some historians push back, suggesting much lower numbers. The debate becomes politicized. Neo-Nazi groups use Dresden to claim moral equivalence between Allied actions and Nazi atrocities. Modern historical research, using careful analysis of city records, survivor testimonies, and archaeological evidence, has established a more accurate figure. The official Dresden Commission report from 2010, based on years of research, confirms approximately 25,000 deaths, with a maximum possible range up to 40,000. This is still a catastrophic death toll. It's still one of the deadliest air raids of the war. But it's far less than the inflated propaganda numbers. For comparison, the Allied bombing of Hamburg in July 1943 killed approximately 43,000. The Japanese bombing of Chongqing, China, between 1938 and 1943 killed over 10,000. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima killed between 70 and 80,000 immediately, with total deaths eventually exceeding 100,000. Dresden was terrible, but it wasn't unique in scale, even if it was unique in targeting a city with limited strategic value so late in the war. Was Dresden a war crime? This question requires understanding what constituted a war crime in 1945. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 provided some rules for aerial warfare, but they were written before strategic bombing existed. They prohibited bombardment of undefended towns, but what constitutes an undefended town? Dresden had anti-aircraft guns. German fighters attempted to intercept the bombers, though unsuccessfully. Does that make it defended? The Geneva Conventions of 1949, created after World War II, partly in response to the horrors of strategic bombing, would eventually establish clearer rules, but they didn't exist in 1945. By the standards of the time, Dresden was arguably legal. Both sides in World War II engaged in strategic bombing of cities. The Germans bombed Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, Coventry. The Japanese bombed Chinese cities relentlessly. The Allies bombed German and Japanese cities. This was accepted military practice, however horrible. But legality and morality are not the same thing. Even if Dresden was technically legal under the laws of war as they existed in 1945, was it morally justified? This is a much harder question. Arguments for Dresden as justified. First, it had legitimate military value. The rail yards were real. Troops did pass through. Industrial facilities did exist. In total war against Nazi Germany, any target that contributes to the enemy war effort is arguably legitimate. Second, it was late in the war, but the war wasn't over. German forces were still fighting. They still had weapons, including new V-2 rockets terrorizing London. The concentration camps were still operating. Every day the war continued meant more deaths. Anything that helped end the war saved lives overall. Third, the Allies were fighting absolute evil. Nazi Germany had murdered 6 million Jews, started a war that killed tens of millions, and committed atrocities across Europe. In that context, can we really judge the Allies too harshly for using every means at their disposal? Arguments against Dresden as justified. First, the military value was limited. Yes, Dresden had rail yards, but so did hundreds of other cities. Why Dresden specifically? Why the city centre rather than just the rail yards? Why this level of destruction? Second, the timing matters. By February 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. The war would end in 3 months. Dresden didn't significantly accelerate that end. It's hard to argue that destroying Dresden shortened the war meaningfully. Third, the deliberate creation of a firestorm that would kill tens of thousands of civilians, including thousands of refugees, goes beyond military necessity. This wasn't precision bombing of industrial targets. This was intentional destruction of a city centre where people lived. Fourth, the double-tap tactic, timing the second wave to catch rescue workers, suggests the intent was to maximize casualties, not just destroy infrastructure. And perhaps most damning, the immediate reaction. Even at the time, many people questioned Dresden. Winston Churchill himself wrote a memo days after the raid questioning whether the bombing of German cities should continue. He was advised to soften the memo's language, but the concern was there. After the war, Arthur Harris, the architect of the area bombing campaign, becomes a controversial figure. Unlike other British military leaders, he is not granted a peerage. There's a sense that the strategic bombing campaign, while militarily defensible, crossed moral lines. Harris defends his decisions until his death. He argues that area bombing shortened the war and saved Allied lives. He points out that German bombing of British cities started the cycle. He insists that in total war against an enemy like Nazi Germany, such measures were necessary. But many of his own crews struggle with what they did. Some bomber pilots and crew members express regret in later years. They followed orders, they did their duty, but they wonder whether it was right. One Lancaster pilot, later interviewed, described seeing Dresden burning from 70 miles away and thinking it looked like hell itself. Another crew member said he never talked about Dresden after the war because he wasn't sure he could justify what happened. The city of Dresden itself takes decades to recover. Under communist rule in East Germany, some ruins are deliberately preserved as anti-Western propaganda. The Frauenkirche remains a collapsed ruin for 50 years, left as a war memorial. After German reunification, Dresden begins serious reconstruction. The Frauenkirche is rebuilt between 1994 and 2005, using original stones where possible and modern materials where necessary. It stands today as both a restoration of the past and a symbol of reconciliation. The bombing of Dresden forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about war, morality, and the limits of military action. In total war, where is the line between military necessity and atrocity? If your enemy is truly evil, and Nazi Germany absolutely was evil, does that justify any action to defeat them? Or are there still moral limits even in war against the worst enemies? Dresden teaches us that good people fighting for just causes can still do terrible things. The Allies were fighting against genocide, against tyranny, against a regime that represented existential evil. They were unquestionably on the right side of history. But that doesn't automatically make every action they took morally correct. It teaches us about the danger of escalation. The strategic bombing campaign began with precision attacks on industrial targets. It evolved into area bombing of cities. Each step seemed justified in context, but the cumulative effect was massive civilian death. Where should the line have been drawn? It teaches us that military effectiveness and moral justification are not the same thing. Area bombing may have damaged German industrial capacity and morale, but even if it was militarily effective, that doesn't automatically make it right. And perhaps most importantly, Dresden teaches us to be skeptical of simple narratives. This isn't a story about evil allies committing war crimes against innocent Germany. Nazi Germany bore full responsibility for starting the war and for the Holocaust. But it's also not a story about purely justified military action. The truth is more complex. War creates situations where there are no good choices, only less bad ones. Sometimes the less bad choice still involves terrible moral costs. On February 13th and 14th, 1945, the Allied air forces destroyed the city of Dresden. Whether this was a justified military action or a war crime remains debated 80 years later. What's not debated is the human cost. 25,000 people died, most of them civilians. A city of extraordinary beauty was destroyed. Families were torn apart. Survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Those deaths weren't abstract statistics. They were people. A mother trying to protect her children in a shelter that became an oven. An elderly couple who survived World War I only to die in their apartment as the firestorm consumed their building. Refugees who fled one horror only to die in another. Firefighters who died trying to save others. Children who never had a chance to grow up. They deserve to be remembered not as propaganda tools, not as debating points in arguments about military strategy, but as human beings who died in terrible circumstances. Today, Dresden has been rebuilt. The Frauenkirche stands again, its dark original stones mixed with light new ones, creating a patchwork that tells the story of destruction and renewal. The city is beautiful again, though it will never be the same city that existed before February 13th, 1945. We remember Dresden not to claim moral equivalence between Allied actions and Nazi atrocities. The Holocaust was a unique, evil, industrialized genocide that stands apart from military actions in war. But we remember Dresden to understand that even just wars involve moral complexity. Even necessary wars involve terrible costs. And even the good side can do things that, at minimum, should give us pause. The question isn't whether Dresden was as bad as Nazi atrocities. It wasn't. The question is whether it needed to happen at all. Whether that particular level of destruction against that particular city at that particular time was justified. History doesn't provide a simple answer, but history does require us to ask the question honestly and to remember the human cost, whatever conclusion we reach. This has been the story of Dresden, a city destroyed, a debate that continues, and a reminder that in war, victory and morality don't always align as neatly as we'd like them to.